I was done with the Silent Hill series. It was an easy thing to tell myself back in 2015, since after the next big title was cancelled and its playable teaser was dramatically and permanently removed from the PlayStation Store, the series was pretty much done with everyone. Its spirit lived on in other, different games. So I wasn't exactly starved of the particular vibe that Silent Hill basically pioneered within the medium of video games. Then in 2022, the Silent Hill Transmission happened. A live-streamed event where not one, but 5 new Silent Hill projects were announced. One of which was the Silent Hill 2 remake I covered in my last video. Silent Hill was back, and I would be lying if I said my curiosity didn't come back with it. I had some concerns, though. The major one being that the publishers at Konami had absolutely no idea what they were doing. That the sheer volume of games announced were merely an attempt to throw some poo-poo at the wall to see if anything would stick. At the time of recording, that concern has not diminished much. I have trust in the developers involved with some of these projects. After all, No Code, the people behind the upcoming title Silent Hill Townfall, created the vastly underrated science fiction horror game Observation. But Konami have burned enough goodwill at this point to provide annual heat for a small country. There was, and still is, a lot at stake, and Konami still have a lot to prove. The first game to be released after the transmission, Silent Hill Ascension, was a thinly veiled microtransaction store pretending to be an interactive web show. A dreadful start, to say the least. One that made it clear that Konami have learned very little from their past mistakes. Worse, they had the gall to make even more terrible ones. The second project to release, which wasn't even announced during the 2022 transmission, was a free PlayStation 5 title called Silent Hill: The Short Message. While not as universally panned as Ascension, it was called out by critics and fans alike for lacking even an ounce of subtlety, being a tasteless simulation of PT, a game that is borderline offensive. Even some of the more positive reviews bring up heavy-handed writing as being one of the game's major issues. I'm here to tell you that if you're one of the people who feel this way about the short message, then maybe, just maybe, this game was never meant for you. On the ground beneath a dilapidated apartment complex stands a memorial grove. It's adorned with numerous colorful bouquets, burnt-out candles, and placards covered in sympathetic post-it notes. This is the Villa, an infamous suicide hotspot for teenage girls in the fictional German town of Kettenstadt. One of these girls was a popular graffiti artist named Maya, who went under the alias Cherry Blossom. In a very Silent Hill 2-esque turn of events, our protagonist, Anita, has received a text message from Maya, requesting to meet her here. At the villa, where Anita is forced to face the truth of Maya's passing, as well as her own unhealthy outlook on their friendship. A friendship that, for Anita, wasn't based on mutual trust and comfort as much as it was based on a one-sided envy. Maya, or rather Cherry Blossom, was admired by an ever-growing number of fans. Anita is not. Her sense of inferiority, which certainly started with the daily abuse she endured while living with her mother, made her resort to both mental and physical self-harm. And, as she reaches the top of the villa, it causes her to step off the roof, thinking that this might be what it takes to finally be noticed. To be like Maya. Pause. If you find this to be a terribly insensitive way of ending the game, with the titular short message implied to be that you can make more out of your life by taking it, rather than soldiering on, well, the game actually agrees with you. As the scene ends, the true message of the game appears. A PSA about suicide prevention. A direct encouragement to the player to seek professional help, if needed. Why then does the game end here, with Anita becoming yet another victim for people to mourn at the memorial grove? The thing is, the game has only just begun. The short message doesn't take place in Silent Hill, but the town's world and mind-bending influence is undoubtedly present in Kettenstadt as well. Like Silent Hill 3, 4, and Homecoming before it, the short message shows us what Silent Hill represents has less to do with a specific geographical location, and more about the personal baggage its characters carry with them. One could almost say that
every town has a
Silent Hill. Joking aside... No wait, I have one more.
Whoa, there are many Silent Hills. Are you sure it's this one?
Okay, now I'm done. Whether it's because of Maya's lingering ghost, or some spiritual power emanating from the villa itself, Anita is not allowed to leave this place, dead or alive, until she has found what Maya has left for her to find. On the path to that eventual discovery, Anita is continuously harassed by copious quantities of insulting post-it notes stuck all over the interior of the villa, physical memories and personal interpretations of her past, as well as a stalker-type enemy which the Silent Hill fanbase infuriatingly voted on calling Sakura Head. Cherry Blossom was right there. It perfectly encapsulates how Anita feels threatened by Maya's artist persona rather than the person behind it. But fuck that, I guess. I said in my video on Silent Hill 2 that, for a game that has been praised for its subtle storytelling, it's not particularly subtle at all. However, compared to the short message, Silent Hill 2 is about as abstract as a Jackson Pollock painting. Every character in the short message wears their every emotion on their sleeve, leaving very little space for the mind to wander. Anita's emotional honesty about Maya having more Twittergram followers than she does may come across as straight up cringeworthy to some players. Though perhaps not as cringeworthy as when an audio flashback of Anita's mom yells at her that "bad things happen because of you!" which might be the most unpoetic piece of dialogue ever recorded for an official Silent Hill title. Heck, the post-it notes alone make for a very literal example of telling rather than showing. The short message rolls with a subtext is for cowards approach to storytelling. But that is not a mistake. The actual mistake is believing that the lack of subtlety wasn't intentional, and then judging the game based on that erroneous belief. If your aim is to critique the short message properly, you need to understand it as a work of young adult fiction. That term might come off as self-explanatory, but I feel like it could use some clarification anyway. For one, it's primarily aimed at an audience between the ages of 11 and 18, and I certainly hope that most people don't categorize 11-year-olds as young adults. In the young adult canon, a literary solar system, authors Victor Malo Uvera and Craig Hill define the term like this:
a teen protagonist speaking from an adolescent point of view, with all the limitations of understanding that implies.
At least that's what the Wikipedia article on young adult literature told me. I didn't actually buy the book to check. It's a suitable definition though, one that definitely puts the story of the short message into perspective. It's heavy-handed, melodramatic, and juvenile. But that's the reality of being a teenager. It's the kind of media that would entice a teenager. It's the reason why a whole bunch of middle and high schoolers built their entire personality around the Linkin Park album Hybrid Theory in the early 2000s. Me included. It's why kids read and adored Twilight. Saying that the writing in the short message is bad solely due to its bluntness is frankly ridiculous, because you don't criticize a book aimed at young readers through a lens one would apply to, say, a Bret Easton Ellis novel. As a critic, you at least need to consider the audience the work is aiming for. Being condescending about it only proves how out of touch you've become with the teenage experience. Teenagers do in fact go through many of the same struggles as adults do, but with the adolescent point of view comes a more limited understanding of those struggles. Tying one's self-worth to having fewer online followers than someone is silly. But by God, have I done that more than once during my years of side gigging as a video essayist. And I'm 30 years old at the time of this recording. The difference is that I, as an adult, have learned to recognize that silliness and can move past it. A formative teenager might not yet possess the tools to conduct such introspection, choosing instead to wallow in self-pity or lash out. Seeing this depicted in the short message is occasionally embarrassing, but it's not embarrassing because of the writing being bad across the board, though it's not exactly perfect. It's embarrassing because we, as in the adult audience, see our younger selves being reflected right back at us, unfiltered. We cringe at the sight of this world because it's how we used to see our own. Before Anita goes to the villa, she reads us a letter she wrote for her adult self. She writes about how seeking connections with others is a sign of weakness, that the strongest animals don't form groups, and that she would rather be independent and strong. The irony of this letter is that it implies that Anita views herself as wise enough about the reality of life to give a lecture to an older version of herself who has experienced so much more of it. Anita's words might convince a fellow teenager, but you don't need a magnifying glass to discover the holes in her logic. The animals we often associate with strength, tigers, lions, elephants, gorillas, bears, and wolves, do form groups, and they do rely on each other to survive. She writes that trying to fit into a group is to betray yourself, which can certainly be true depending on the circumstance, but she completely disregards that trying to fit in can also be an act of empathy, of catering to the needs of people who we deem to be deserving of it. Not to mention that there are social groups that we find and join exactly because they don't require us to betray ourselves. Anita is clearly wrong. She contradicts herself in this letter just as much as she does throughout the rest of the game. And she's likely aware of it too, because while the letter ends with her declaring that she wishes to be alone, she also admits that she wants somebody to understand her, something that would require closeness to people. Anita attempts to take control over her sense of loneliness by telling herself that she wants it, rather than letting other people in to see how vulnerable she really is. This is not an experience that I currently relate to, but I certainly could have when I was around the same age as Anita, or any of the young players this game was actually made for. But don't take my word for it. Here is scenario writer Kiichi Kano saying he was personally invested in sending out a positive message to a generation that is experiencing so much pain. In the same interview, concept artist and franchise legend Masahiro Ito agrees that the short message will likely resonate with a younger audience, who spend more time on social media. In my video on Silent Hill 2, I talked about thoughtful representation of mental health issues, and my wish for more stories about such issues to include a sense of hope, which some viewers were surprisingly resistant to. It seems to me that these viewers interpreted my take as being against depictions of suicide-related tragedies wholesale, as if I was advocating for blanket censorship of said tragedies. If that were the case, I would not be speaking fondly about the short message. There are aspects of the game that could rightly be called sensationalistic. The subplot about Anita's abusive mother, for example, culminates with the revelation that her younger brother was once locked in a closet until he starved to death, after which their mother hid his corpse in the kitchen freezer. For being a game that is somewhat grounded, apart from the supernatural influence of Silent Hill, this doesn't add much apart from some jarringly misplaced shock value. The strength of the short message's story is its relatable and contemporary subject matter. Dead Fridge Brother? Dead Fridge Brother is less relatable. There's also a scene where we get a needlessly explicit look into Anita's habit of physical self-harm, as well as a diary entry where it's implied that Amelie, Anita and Maya's shared friend, has a brother with an incestuous interest in her, a plot point that leads absolutely nowhere. Even with these questionable narrative choices, the short message ultimately manages to stick the landing, because while it spends a significant amount of its runtime wallowing in misery, it also stays true to the idea of sending out a positive message to those who desperately need to hear it. Anita realizes that Maya might have taken her life because of a letter she wrote for Amelie, requesting her help. Anita was entrusted to deliver this letter, but withheld it out of jealousy. Later, Anita also realizes how much Maya actually cared for her when she finds Cherry Blossom's final work of art, a piece depicting Anita. As she stands on the rooftop of the villa for the last time, she calls Amelie to say goodbye, to let her know that she's about to go and apologize to Maya. But then, just as she is about to step off, she receives a text message from Amelie, asking to meet up for shopping the next day. The mundanity of the request stumps her. She stumbles backwards, as the all-encompassing fog quickly dissipates around her, marking her tormentuous journey of self-discovery through the villa as complete. The game ends with Anita reading a revised version of her opening letter. She repeats her words about the strongest animals not forming groups and that adapting to a group is to betray yourself, but concludes that she doesn't mind all that. because she can finally admit to herself that she cares more about being understood by the people around her, that she wants to keep going for the sake of the people she loves. And now that she has emotionally matured, she addresses the letter to her younger self instead, to assure her that everything is going to be alright, or at least that it can be. The developers could absolutely have ended the game with Anita stepping off that roof. It's what happened to all those other girls at the villa, and similarly tragic ends occur all over the real world after all. But that is not the point. Storytellers can choose to focus on the reality of people not being able to deal with their trauma, of their lives coming to tragic ends. You can make compelling stories about that. But if stories about mental health should be tragic for the sake of realism, shouldn't they also be hopeful for the same reason? I don't believe it's controversial to say that the primary goal of someone struggling with mental health issues is to find healthy ways of mitigating the pain to the point that life becomes bearable. Had I personally not strived towards that goal, had I not persevered through my darkest of days as a young adult, chances are I wouldn't even be here. That's why hope is so important. It's a lifeline that can manifest in many different ways. For Anita, it's a supportive friend, as well as the prospect of starting a new life far away from the crumbling socioeconomic state of Kettenstadt. For someone else, it could be medical treatment, or a damn good therapist. There's hope to find even after a tragedy has occurred. And I believe stories which explore that shouldn't be dismissed for attempting to censor reality. Because there's so much more to reality than misery. Creating fiction for a younger audience is obviously not an excuse to lower the bar for quality. Likewise, a critic should not be less critical because of the intended audience. But they should at least be aware of who the intended audience is, and adjust their critical lens accordingly. The short message was admittedly put in an awkward position, given that it was the first proper Silent Hill game to release after the great paradigm shift that was PT. The comparisons were inevitable, and they were warranted to some extent. Both games revolve around exploring looping environments from a first-person perspective. Both make gradually more disturbing changes to those environments with every new loop. And both are, of course, part of the same franchise. That's where the major similarities end, though. In actuality, the short message shares less DNA with PT than with the required literature I was handed in middle school, which dealt with topics like loneliness, bullying, and parental neglect in an equally blunt fashion. That kind of fiction isn't less important or meaningful than adult fiction, because its function is to complement adult fiction. It's a necessary stepping stone in the development of children's understanding of media, themselves, and the world. School children aren't just required to read books, but analyze them, write reports, and discuss them in class. And so those books need to be on a level that children can easily comprehend and study their various themes. However, the short message isn't only a piece of young adult fiction. It's also, as previously stated, a very blatant PSA. The story, the repeated calls to action, even some of the collectible documents, all serve the purpose of bringing attention to the topic of suicide prevention. Hell, the game's official website features a message from Japan's Ministry of Health. There's a long history of televised PSAs that have become infamous due to their overly dramatic and oftentimes absurd depictions of real-life problems.
Shame on you. You can never control the consequences if you speed.
You may find these kinds of PSAs to be laughable, but the fact is that you remember them. When the main goal is to get an important message across, isn't remembering it the most important thing of all? I'd argue that packaging the titular short message within a provocative horror game makes it infinitely more memorable than if it were presented during a routine school assembly. Just like how a basic message about appreciating your life is given significantly more weight when it appears in a Saw film. It's not a particularly deep story, and to someone with years of knowledge about fiction, it's not exactly a novel one either. But since the aim was to speak to a younger, more impressionable audience, this could very well be someone's first time experiencing a story like this. It's perhaps not what Silent Hill fans expected, or wanted, but there's no denying that the short message achieves what it set out to achieve. Personally, I think it's neat that Silent Hill can go beyond the borders of its titular town, beyond its regular audience, to tell different stories for different purposes. It's actually something I suggested when I started this channel 5 years ago. And with the arrival of the short message, and the hopeful arrival of Silent Hill Townfall and F, I'm crossing my fingers that Konami and the various dev teams making them will be able to pull off that vision. Because while I do appreciate the short message, and its reason for being, it was never meant for me. But maybe it could mean a lot to someone else. Well, I guess now I can say that I've successfully edited a whole video with a broken arm. This December, I slipped on some ice and received a fracture below my right shoulder. It still hurts, and it's still hard to move it, but luckily there's already been a lot of improvement. Although, not being able to do my day job has resulted in a quite significant financial hit. So if you liked this video, or if you just want to support me out of pity, the best way to do so is by becoming a patron. And speaking of, I wish to thank those who are already supporting me with $5 a month or more. They are Anaday, Callum Wally, D.E. Wright, Duncan Scott, Eben Phantom, Emmeline, Frans Johannes Foilner, Håvard Kugerud, Icarus Harker, Jesse Earl, Kalis, L. Tantevi, Lesser Sage of Stars, Losty, Nicole, Quillightful, Robin Hartz, Rowan Woodcock, Sable Cowl, Sethsard, Silk Moth, TB Skyen, 10 Tiny Kittens, and Vinders. I also want to thank Daniel Santos and Mira Cox for proofreading the script, and David J. Bradley for lending their voice to this video. I'm gonna keep making Silent Hill related videos for a bit, so expect one about Silent Hill 4 dropping relatively soon, or at least as soon as my physical health will allow anyway. Or hey, maybe you're watching this in the future and it's already out. Either way, until next time, don't go breaking any bones out there, okay?
Do you think there's a difference between dreams and reality?
Oh, what happened to the small talk? No, what's your favorite band? Do you Facebook? Nothing like that?
Fuck Facebook.